call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Days get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions. Thank you for joining with us. We're on session 13 and we've reached Judges chapter 20. In the last two sessions, we saw how the religious and moral life of the tribes, those loosely knit tribes that formed or shaped the people of Israel, had totally collapsed. We're now moving on to see how the system of justice also had collapsed and how a proportional response to a crime being committed has long gone away from the people. There seems to be a lack of good guidance and good judgment. So in that sense, the rule of justice has also collapsed within the nation. So to read Judges chapter 20, I've invited my friend David Suchet again to do that for us.
Judges chapter 20. Then all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and from the land of Gilead, came together as one and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 men armed with swords. The Benjaminites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, "Tell us how this awful thing happened." So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, "I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. During the night the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance, because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel. Now all you Israelites, speak up and tell me what you have decided to do." All the men rose up together as one, saying, "None of us will go home. No, not one of us will return to his house. But now this is what we'll do to Gibeah. We'll go up against it in the order decided by casting lots. We'll take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000, to get provisions for the army. Then when the army arrives at Gibeah in Benjamin, it can give them what they deserve for this outrageous act done in Israel." So all the Israelites got together and united as one against the city. The tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." But the Benjaminites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. From their towns they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. At once the Benjaminites mobilized 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 able young men from those living in Gibeah. Among all these soldiers there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 swordsmen, all of them fit for battle. The Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. They said, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Benjaminites?" The Lord replied, "Judah shall go first." The next morning the Israelites got up and pitched camp near Gibeah. The Israelites went out to fight the Benjaminites and took up battle positions against them at Gibeah. The Benjaminites came out of Gibeah and cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. But the Israelites encouraged one another and again took up their positions where they had stationed themselves the first day. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until evening. And they inquired of the Lord. They said, "Shall we go up again to fight against the Benjaminites, our fellow Israelites?" The Lord answered, "Go up against them." Then the Israelites drew near to Benjamin the second day. This time, when the Benjaminites came out from Gibeah to oppose them, they cut down another 18,000 Israelites, all of them armed with swords. Then all the Israelites, the whole army, went up to Bethel, and there they sat, weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening, and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days the ark of the covenant of God was there, with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. They asked, "Shall we go up again to fight against the Benjaminites, our fellow Israelites, or not?" The Lord responded, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." Then Israel set an ambush around Gibeah. They went up against the Benjaminites on the third day, and took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. The Benjaminites came out to meet them, and were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before, so that about 30 men fell in the open field and on the roads, the one leading to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. While the Benjaminites were saying, "We are defeating them as before," the Israelites were saying, "Let's retreat and draw them away from the city to the roads." All of the men of Israel moved from their places and took up positions at Baal Tamar, and the Israelite ambush charged out of its place on the west of Gibeah. Then 10,000 of Israel's able young men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjaminites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjaminites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjaminites saw that they were beaten. Now the men of Israel had given way before Benjamin, because they relied on the ambush they had set near Gibeah. Those who had been in ambush made a sudden dash into Gibeah, spread out and put the whole city to the sword. The Israelites had arranged with the ambush so that they should send up a great cloud of smoke from the city, and then the Israelites would counterattack. The Benjaminites had begun to inflict casualties on the Israelites, about 30, and they said, "We are defeating them as in the first battle." But when the column of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjaminites turned and saw the whole city going up in smoke. Then the Israelites counterattacked, and the Benjaminites were terrified, because they realized that disaster had come on them. So they fled before the Israelites in the direction of the wilderness, but they could not escape the battle. And the Israelites who came out of the towns cut them down there. They surrounded the Benjaminites, chased them, and easily overran them in the vicinity of Gibeah on the east. 18,000 Benjaminites fell, all of them valiant fighters. As they turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, the Israelites cut down 5,000 men along the roads. They kept pressing after the Benjaminites as far as Gidom, and struck down 2,000 more. On that day, 25,000 Benjaminite swordsmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 of them turned and fled into the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed for 4 months. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. All the towns they came across they set on fire.
Chapter 20 invites us really to see the response that is going to be made to the terrible, terrible things that have happened in the town of Gibeah. The gang rape of a woman, which ultimately, of course, led to her death. The way that her body is cut up into 12 sections and the way that it's distributed out to the 12 tribes of Israel. Inevitably, there will be a response to that, such is the horrific nature of what has taken place. A terrible, terrible crime has been committed. And what the author wants us to grasp is that this crime has not taken place among a foreign people, a people outside of Israel. This has actually taken place within the community of Israel. And I think the writer really wants us to almost catch our breath, to take that on board, that here we see the covenant committed people of Israel. And within that, all these fundamentals of life have totally broken down. And this, of course, has led to this terrible situation and this terrible murder taking place. If it takes something terrible to bring the nations or the tribes of Israel together, then I could guess that this is the opportunity. Such is the power of the distribution of the mutilated body, that it brings together the tribal leaders of the nation of Israel. And of course, you get that sense of a united Israel coming together to face up to what has happened and to see what actions need to result because of it. But it's not a united state of Israel, because of course Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, take the opportunity not to take part in this gathering of these tribes. Well, you can understand, because of course Gibeah was a Benjamite's town, and therefore they don't want to get caught up in all of this. They're probably very cautious about the response that's going to come from the other 11 tribes. Initially, when the tribes come together, it gives the appearance that justice is about to take place, that the right thing is about to be done. But I think the author wants us to see that what actually happens as an outcome of this gathering of the different tribes is that they don't seem capable of bringing about a just and proportional response to this crime. As bad as this crime is, the way that it's dealt with needs to be just and proportional. But of course, that whole religious and moral fiber has broken down, and alongside it is, of course, the rule of justice. All of that has fallen apart within these tribal groups, and they don't seem able or don't even think about making the right and the correct kind of response to what has taken place. We're reintroduced, of course, to our Levites. He's asked the question, tell us, the tribal leaders say, tell us how this happened. The Levite is called to give an account, which of course includes not just the murder of his concubine, but also to give an account of why he felt it was necessary to distribute these body parts to each of the tribes. Well, without taking any of the terror away from the actual incident itself, the terrible gang rape and murder of this concubine, without taking anything away from the horror of all of that, I think it's true to say that the Levite here gives a bit of an embellished view of what has taken place. It isn't, in other words, quite accurate. And I think the author wants us to notice that and not get caught up in some some mission of revenge or vengeance or whatever. What he says isn't quite true. He doesn't mention the fact that indeed he was the one who ultimately pushed his concubine out to the men. And also then, he doesn't give an account of why the door was locked all night, and how at the end of the night, the door was opened and there she was laying on the threshold, her hands on the threshold of the house. And what is interesting is that no one seems to challenge that. No one seems to think very deeply about what's taken place and how accurate his account is. How could it be that she ended up outside in the first place? How could it be that she was locked out all night? Clearly, the tribal leaders have forgotten or neglecting the ability to cross-examine. They don't really seem all that interested in going deeper into the truth of what has actually taken place. And I think at that point, the author really wants us to realize that a judge like Deborah, who was seen and presented very much as a very righteous judge, a judge who gave reasoned and wise decisions, that kind of judge no longer exists in Israel amongst the tribes. All of that has gone, and there is no one there who's going to make a wise and counseled judgment, who's going to say this is the just and proportional response that we need to make to it. And all of that reflects, of course, the desperate state of the nation at the time. Naturally, the Levite seizes his moment, and who can blame him for that when he says, "Now all of you Israelites, speak up and give your verdict." In other words, what are you going to do about this? What is noticeable here is that this isn't a court. This isn't a court that's governed by witnesses giving their testimonies and then a judge making a wise and reflective decision. This is an army, and the army are ready for action. And you can almost sense that the outcome is inevitable. This isn't going to be a fair trial as far as the tribe of Benjamin is concerned. So, almost instinctively, without investigating further, maybe in the light of the horror of that mutilated body part, the tribal leaders commit to punishing the perpetrators. The town of Gibeah will pay a very high price for what has happened. Perhaps we might see, and we might ask, is it a just one? Well, it could only have been a small group of men who had carried out this terrible deed. Everyone else seems to have disappeared or out of fear into their own homes. Well, you could accuse them of running away from the crime, but I think at the end of the day, what is going to be seen is disproportional. It's not really a just response. It's a overreactive, out of control kind of response to what has taken place. Israel has long slid beneath the tide, the surface of justice and truth, and that doesn't seem fully to come into the equation here. Whatever the outcome of their gathering, the bringing together of the tribal leaders, well, it's going to be bloody, and it's going to lead to what one could only describe as a civil war. The Benjamites, of course, quite naturally refuse to give in to this threat, and they very quickly muster a very large and capable fighting force. against the rest of Israel. It's interesting how the author makes reference to these left-handed sling men who are so skilled. And I guess in one sense, the author is trying to take us back to Ehud, the left-handed assassin, as we saw him earlier on in the book of Judges. And I think what the implication is there that the Benjamite response is going to be both cunning as well as skilled. And clearly the Benjamites' army is a very skilled, but also a very cunning unit. What is also noticeable here is the way that the tribal leaders decide to bring about what they perceive to be the just settlement of this situation. It is very reminiscent of chapter 1 of the book of Judges, where we're told about the way that the tribes carry out the occupation and in turn the settlement of the lands. And I think the author's trying to do that deliberately. He's trying to take us back there, but things are different. In Judges chapter 1, you sense that the people are still in a good place in relation to God, and God is leading them. They're looking to God for leadership. Very different to where the nation is in Judges 20, where religiously and morally and socially and in terms of justice and truth, the whole nation, the whole tribal system has collapsed. This is not going to be straightforward. This is not going to be a repeat of Judges chapter 1. This is now Judges chapter 20. But a mysterious thing takes place, and in some senses it's good to have the opportunity to think about this. It's because the author really tells us that the 11 tribes, once they have organized themselves into a military force, well, they go before the Lord and they inquire of the Lord. Is this the right time to attack? Is this going to be the right way to bring about what they consider to be an act of justice? And there's confusion around all of this because on the surface it seems, well, if they're inquiring of the Lord, then what they're getting back is not the right thing at all. And again, we're following that pattern of chapter 1 of Judges, where the people inquire of the Lord, but there they get the right kind of response from God. Here we see that this broken nation, this faraway nation, even though they come to inquire of the Lord, they're so disconnected from God, is that what happens is that what they hear and they perceive to be right brings about great destruction as far as their armies are concerned. Clearly, to go up against them, as we saw in Judges chapter 1, which brought about the success of the occupation and settlement, in Judges 20, to go up against them, well, it's almost as if God is using that as a means of righteous judgment on his own people. The guarantee that go up against them is going to bring about success, as it was in Judges chapter 1, has long now disappeared. There is a disconnect in the processes of coming before God and hearing what they perceive to be the right thing, and of course the outcome. Like Samson, they're having to learn that the strength of God is not something that they can assume is always going to be with them. And here, they make that mistake. The assumption is if they require of the Lord and what they hear from the Lord go up against them, well, the outcome is going to be good. When in fact, Judges 20 tells us the opposite. The outcome is the result of God's righteous judgments on his own people. When we look at the battle, it's fair to say that at first Benjamin inflicts a huge loss on the combined tribal armies. But eventually, numbers count and strategy counts. And even though initially Benjamin appears to be the stronger tribe against these 11 tribes, eventually Benjamin is caught in a pincer movement between two groups, two individual forces of the 11 tribes of Israel. A force that is out in the desert, drawing the Benjamite forces away from Gibeah, and then an army swooping in, a force swooping in behind, facing the town itself. So in other words, you get that sense that the Benjamites are caught between. They don't realize it initially, but soon they will, because as they look back at the city, they will see that their destruction, the outcome, is inevitable. And it's a massive slaughter. The numbers in chapter 20 of soldiers that were massacred are staggering. And here we see this massive slaughter of the tribal soldiers who come from the tribe of Benjamin. And of course, the town itself, Gibeah, is routed completely. And again, everything's out of proportion. Nothing is just. It's not a case of going in and putting on trial the men who carried out that horrendous crime. But the scale of the battle and what's going on is staggering, and it reflects God's righteous judgment on his own people for where they are at this particular point in time. And the story concludes towards the end of Judges chapter 20 with a terrible picture, a terrible image of the bodies of the tribal soldiers all over the place, scattered all over the place, together with the dead carcasses of animals. It's very reflective of a civil war, a thing that's got completely out of proportion and has led to the most incredible violence and the most terrible outcome. If chapter 19 gave us one mutilated body, then chapter 20 gives us thousands upon thousands of mutilated body. It's a bleak picture, but the author wants us to look at it and say, this is where the nation is. This is how it looks now. It's a long way from where God would have wanted it to be. It's bloody and it's brutal. There's no justice. There's no genuine faith or religious life. There's no social life. There is only destruction and death. And of course, there is no morality within the nation. It is a pitiful picture of how far the nation has gone from its covenant commitments to the true God of Israel. I think verse 35 captures for us what the author is trying to say. Fundamentally, all of this is the Lord's doing. It's the outcome of his response to the failures of his own people and his righteous judgments upon them. Righteous judgment has come to the whole nation, a nation who we have seen for the last 20 chapters on this downward spiral until it hit rock bottom. And again, I guess if we thought chapter 19 or some of the previous chapters, we had reached that point. Here again, we see that there's a way to go. And rock bottom is a long, long way down for this nation that has broken its covenant promises with God, the God of faithful covenant.
chains get broken, set my body free. Oh, Lord, remember me, remember me. Oh, Lord, remember me. Oh, Lord, remember me. When chains get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me. When these chains get broken, set my spirit